Good evening. Welcome to the closing ceremony of the 4th UNESCO-UNITWIN Symposium. My name is Chung Hong-jo of the Hongik University. I will be your moderator. The International Arts Education Week is hosting the 4th UNESCO-UNITWIN Symposium, and this shows how we are connecting research with education. This feels very meaningful. Especially today, we have participatory education as a main theme of this week, and also the UNITWIN theme of education in action, and you can see that we are looking for the role of education in arts as well as the practice of arts education in these times of crisis. It seems that the organizers of the symposium has selected various presentations, and in classifying the presentations into different sessions, we had one consideration in mind. We believe that all of the dialogue should start at the field and finish at the field. And so, other than the two keynote presentations, the first session and the last session was on the arts and education in the field. And in 2021, we believe that a core part of arts education is diversity, as well as social and artistic inclusion, arts immersion, art in the classroom, and also the Seoul Agenda by incorporating all of these topics into our sessions. Well, concerning each of the sessions, let us take this opportunity to look back on each of the sessions that we had conducted during the symposium. So here we have the gathering of UNITWIN members and arts education researchers, and we asked each of the participants for the closing ceremony to summarize one session at a time. Let's take a look at the members who are here on site. We have Chairperson Park Shin-hee of the Korea Arts and Culture Education Service, Director Hong Yu-jin of the Korea Arts and Culture Education Service, Associate Professor Kim In-seol of Catholic University, Director Shin Hae-sun, who is the co-founder of We Culture Research and Consulting. We also have online participants, Professor Amelie Achun-Akuning of Kenya, Professor Ralph Buck of the University of Auckland in New Zealand, Professor Boa Long, professor at the Education University of Hong Kong, and Professor Shefro Shaman from the University of Haifa of Israel. So let us take a look at each session through each of the panelists here today. First, we will turn to Professor Akno. Could you review the first plenary session?
Thank you very much, and good morning, good evening. I can hear that I have an echo. Good, that sounds better. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I listened to and thoroughly enjoyed the presentation by Ernst Wagner and the panel that came after him. And it is always a pleasure to listen to the UNITWIN members. I picked a couple of things. Ernst gave us the concept of Arts Education 2.0 and gave us two questions that I picked up. The first was, how can we share the owning of global knowledge? The second question, what is the role of the UNITWIN in this? And I think coming from Ernst's wide, extensive global network and research, these things have informed his perspective. He gave us the highlight that indicated the continuity between INRE into the UNITWIN and the issues of diversity in arts education. And he proposed a look at cultural diversity in an intra and international or intra and interterritorial way. And that then takes us towards the need for international cooperation. How do we go about that? He brought out the idea that there are similarities in our diversities and took one symbol really to demonstrate this, that the art symbols that we have normally have dual meanings. And the symbols are mostly associated with cultural diversity and national unity. And I asked myself, what is the lesson for me in Kenya? And another question that I asked myself is, are diversity and unity mutually exclusive? Perhaps not. But Ernst indicated to us that the objects that are glaringly different at face value may, at the level of symbolism, be very similar. The key to discovering this is in what they symbolize or what they mean to their users, to the people who originated them. Their cultural value and their significance are within the context of their making, within the context of their use. And he had another phrase, the complex, entangled interactions of objects creating a hybrid intellectual space. Ernst has big words, doesn't he? But here, we're getting lessons for diversity in arts education. The first lesson is that these objects are symbols which are imbued with meaning by those who use them. The second lesson is that our perceptions are clothed in our own experiences. So we're talking about the interpretation of artworks. Reminds me of a publication that we did much earlier on, and the title was, Whose Arts Education Is It Anyway? And I remember John O'Toole with that. He also talked about the language that we use, which is normally tied to the existence of the concept of art or art education within our experiences. And the question is, if you don't have a terminology in your own language for art education, does it mean that it is not there? Made me think that in several cultures, art is not an abstraction. It is not a phenomenon that is removed from daily existence, but it is an expression of who we are, of what we do, of how we do it, and of with what we do it. And so a lot of these symbols, a lot of these objects are the things with which we do daily living. Then we had the panel. Benjamin gave us an interesting historical input, and I liked the way that he brought to us the notion of arts having been isolated from other processes of living, and therefore the autonomy of the arts. And he talked of art and arts education from a more engaged space. We need to have that. Gloria urged us to listen to each other, because when we do that, we will then enhance the effectiveness of the diversity element in our arts education, which should facilitate, which should help us to stop being judgmental as we look at other people's arts. As we look at other people's arts expressions, it will help us to see those arts the way the makers of the arts see them. I liked a statement from Neril, I can only represent it as I see it. Isn't that true? We see things, we understand things based on our own experience, on our own background. And then Eugene really contextualized this for the hosting country, for South Korea, when she talked of the diversity of arts within even small nations, and urged us to think of methodologies and ways of thinking about art as we go global. And she urged us to try and understand people's unique environments for us to avoid misunderstanding their arts. So in a nutshell, I found this to be a very well-focused session. I found it aligned to the objectives of UNITWIN. I found it really touching on the Seoul agenda, and I found it really encouraging me to listen a lot more to the proceedings of this conference, because there was something historical, there's something about today, and there's something about the future for arts education and social cohesion through the understanding of the art of the other person. In short, can you see through the other person's eye? Can you hear through their ears? Can you feel through their bodies? To do that, we have to step into their context, because that is how their meaning can be shared. Thank you.
와, 감사합니다. 아쿠노 교수님.
Thank you very much. Well, Dr. Wagner talked about how we can possess this global knowledge and what can UNITWIN do. Well, concerning the second question, Professor Wagner talked about international collaboration. Well, I believe that UNITWIN is in fact aligned with international collaboration. So we had a great summary of the presentation itself and the discussion to follow. Thank you very much. Following the plenary session, we had session 1. As I mentioned before, we had 8 sessions, and the first session and the last session was about arts and education in the field. The first session covered Arts and Education Field 1, and we had 5 presenters. I will be reviewing this session. Well, we had Director Chung Yong-sung from the National Theatre Company of Korea talk about the theater is a small earth, and he talked about preemptive strategies, followed by Director Lee Eun-soo of the National Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in Korea. She talked about the various examples of art museums responding to climate change, and she also talked about the response of MMCA concerning the pandemic. We also heard from curator Kim So-won of Seongbuk Museum of Art, and she introduced the Art Sunanro project that brought together various artists of Seongbuk. She also showed us how this project brought public-private participation so that we could have a healthy network of artists even within the pandemic situation. Then we listened to Professor Kim Soo-yeon of Kyongsang University, and she talked about theater in education under the title of The Suspicious Dining Table. So students were able to participate in theater and drama activities to seriously or whimsically approach various social issues. The active participation in cultural dialogue is also seen in Professor Iboram's presentation. Professor Iboram talked about how the disability art groups of Korea and Australia work together to create collaboration. And that actually is very important in the perspective of diversity, and it brings together the topic of Dr. Ernest Wagner of international collaboration. Next, we would like to invite Professor Ralph Buck. Maybe we can talk about some more detailed cases. Session 2 covered arts for healing. Would you like to review that session for us, please?
Kia ora, talofa, and hello, everyone. Welcome to our panel, and it's a big hello from New Zealand in the Pacific. So the panel I listened to was all about how educators and arts therapists are positioning and using arts in healing and education contexts. And this discussion fitted very well with Larry O'Farrell's introduction in the opening ceremony, where he talked about the Soul Agenda having this role to speak to social economic inequities and supporting our communities. So the panel had 4 speakers. The first speaker was Tina Kukkonen from Queen's University in Canada, and she spoke about supporting youth with mental health in, through, and about the arts. She looked at mental health statistics for youth and made a strong argument why young people need art practices as part of their education in their early education. She talked about the importance of teachers seeing the students, seeing what's happening with the students' lives, and then doing something about it and using the arts to do something about it, and being courageous to use the arts in an ongoing way. She raised, I think, for me, a very interesting topic, and that is arts therapy or arts education, and notes the difference between these two and the overlap between those two, and that there's a sliding scale between arts education, arts therapy, and there are grey zones between those two. And I think that's an interesting space for educators in the future, and we might come to that later on. She also talked about how teaching artists use the arts in creative processes, noting that the creative process is the key element. How arts support youth and mental health, and how we create safe spaces. Most importantly, she focused on arts engaging young people, arts facilitating the making process. It's the doing and the making that she stressed, and also the fun. The next speaker was Sanja Tasic from Serbia, and she spoke about a project of hers called Ecology of the Soul. And she was working in classrooms, and she identified the classroom as a community and used the African philosophy of Ubuntu to focus on interconnection and interaction of humanity with others. There is the Ubuntu saying, I am because we are, which is a very interesting philosophical position in community arts. So she focuses on arts as a social act of meaning making. She referenced Augusto Boal and his humanizing of society theories, and looked at the responsibility of arts educators to support young people now and post-COVID, and educating young people to be actors in a new society as we go forward. And I think that's a nice point to be thinking of what's next after this pandemic world, and how will young people be actors, metaphorically and literally, in that new society. The third speaker was Marietta Bettman from the University of South Africa, and she spoke to her study of teaching life skills in primary school for primary school children. She also used Boal's theories and particularly focused on using forum theatre as her main methodology for getting children involved. So the key thing was what life skills are gained through forum theatre. Her research found that learners can identify problems and solutions, though they struggled with role play to perform solutions and resolve some of the conflict or issues. Teachers had a very key role in guiding the children, and one of the main findings was that teacher training needs to include much more experiential teaching strategies in regard to supporting life skills for primary school children. The fourth speaker was from Korea, Chaeun Kim, and she is an arts therapist, and she spoke specifically about the role of art therapy in the pandemic era. She noted that in 2020 in Korea, that violence had increased tenfold, and that art therapists had a role in diffusing that and dealing with some of the outcomes of that violence. And the mental difficulties was described as the fourth wave of trauma. And I think that's an interesting thing, that let's just pretend in future when the pandemic is finished, there will probably be this slow tsunami of mental issues. And I'm sure most of us as teachers see this in our classrooms already, but I think it's definitely something on the rise. So Chaeyoon spoke about how arts and language can be used as means for structuring and reviewing trauma, and how the arts provide specific means for accessing emotions, feelings, and thoughts. So the things that were common amongst the four talks that I found interesting, the first thing was the importance of having young people being active, doing art, doing music, doing drama, doing dance. It's the doing that was the most important thing. Another point was that they all spoke about the increased engagement young people have when they are given arts experiences. So they're more engaged in wellness issues when they're dealing it through art experience. They all nearly spoke about teachers and therapists need more experiential education in their training. The role and value of arts therapy is emerging, but still young in its application in different contexts. So the whole thing of having therapy for younger people is an interesting and growing area of concern. Implementing arts therapy in schools was raised several times, and I had a question about whether it's about arts and wellness or arts and healing. And I'm sort of more interested in a way about the more holistic notion of wellness and how that can be used in the education context, rather than placing the responsibility of healing upon teachers when that's not their job. And that comes to my final point of the distinction between education and therapy and how they can work together, but we can't assume that they are the same thing or that the same people can do those same things. So that was the main thrust of that talk. It was great. I enjoyed it a lot. Thank you very much. 감사합니다.
감사합니다, 랄프 벅 교수님. 저도
Very much,
마찬가지로
Professor
그
Buck.
교수님께서 지적하셨던
And like it was mentioned, I also thought about arts education and arts therapy, and also that I was able to think about the differences. It was a very informative session. And also at the same time, while session 2 was being conducted, we had session 3 ongoing.
Session 3 was on social and cultural inclusiveness. We would like to invite Professor Boa Long to summarize this session for us.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm honored to review this session. And during the session, there were 3 presentations that I heard, and I have to congratulate all the presenters that they have done really a good job. They have provided some innovative ideas or thinking about arts education, and especially how arts and arts education can function in the society. Now, the first one was presented by Tel Kim. It's about a very innovative idea. Actually, I would say because when everybody in the world is thinking how to deal with the pandemic, we normally use the technology, kind of distance learning, to help with those children. They have to stay at home, they cannot go to school, etc. So technology seems to be the only direction or the only solution for the pandemic. But Tel Kim suggested that actually some traditional or alternative ways to keep those remote learning for those children who are in difficult situations. For example, they don't have the computer, they don't have any cell phones, etc. So now this is very useful, and because it seems that we have ignored those children who are in difficult situations. Okay, so we may need more details, however, of how distance learning can be delivered to those invulnerable children. And in order to encourage or convince the governments and schools, etc., to support such sustainable policy. I think impact of arts education should be continuously advocated, and some empirical studies are needed. So actually, I was expected that there would be some practical approaches or suggestions that we can really apply in our situation. Okay, so I just got a kind of suggestion that perhaps technology is unavoidable. So a combination with traditional ways and technological approaches is another way. Now, for example, when the author suggested that we may go back to radio broadcasting to help with those children, they may not have computers, but radio is cheap enough to own, then radio broadcasting may be a traditional way, but useful way. So I would think that after radio broadcasting, those materials can also be recorded and disseminated through the internet, or so that some children or some families may also can receive those information. The second presentation is from Charlene from Singapore. She focused on about cultural identity and cultural competencies. So she focused on how arts, especially theater, can help with those global crises, such as discrimination or war, etc. So the theater may reflect real stories for audiences' reflexivity. Now, in Singapore, it is their reality that there were different official languages with different ethnic people. So they are Chinese, they are Malay, and they are Indians and others. Okay, so you can imagine the multicultural in that country. So their issue is about how to make those different ethnic people in a equal situation for the development of country. So using the theater as a media to bring the stories of different individual stories and of the people can provoke thinking of the issues of, for example, cultural identity and national identity. So the project actually truly reflects the specific issues in Singapore. And I think it also acts as a case study for other regions' references and reconsideration. So nowadays, in many countries, we have different ethnics, we have different cultures. So it's also another big issue for many of us for our consideration. Now, the third presentation was by Nan Zhang, who is studying in Australia. The lady was talking about another very useful way of using arts education to change the society. Now, she tried to integrate dance education with second language education to promote social cohesion. Now, the idea was wonderful. And actually, this is empirical research. She tries to do a case study with some interviews with different students and teachers and other stakeholders. The idea is to try to involve those younger children in dancing so that through the dancing, the children can learn about the culture of the second language. Now, the case is in Australia, but the language is Greek. Okay, that school is about teaching Greek as a second language in Australia. Okay, so the children, while they learn the dance, they use their language in Greek, so that they can simultaneously learn about second language. So I think, of course, this is a good idea, especially in terms of research. I was just thinking that apart from interviews, maybe class observation might be useful in reflecting how students would learn the second language and social development through the dance education. Perhaps this is a doctoral study, and I believe that the researcher would do also observation, but within this limited presentation, she has not mentioned about this. Now, after reviewing all these three presentations, I think in general, I found that arts education can be very functional to help solving specific problems if appropriately planned, designed, and implemented. But however, we need more empirical evidences to support such ideas and such functions in order to achieve those goals. And arts and arts education can also be very useful in diverse situations. For example, encouraging personal expression so that our children, our learners can express themselves, or to encourage reflection of the reality, the society, the community, and stimulation for reflexivity. So all the arts involve those people in rethinking, reconsideration the reality. So while arts education promote and inform the public and the governments, these functions can change the society and improve the society. This is the most important point. So after all, reviewing all this, I have 2 points for kinds of implications. The first is that advocacy of arts education is important. Just because arts is so useful and functional in the society, so we as the arts educators should continue to advocate arts education in the society through empirical research. Now, right now, arts education is still, to a certain extent, marginalized in many communities and countries. So the effort of advocacy is still necessary. The second is that collaboration among organizations, such as the UNITWIN, from different regions, different countries, to convince the government and convince the policymakers is really necessary. So this is also fulfilling the ultimate aims of the UNITWIN. So I hope that we can continue to work together with all this collaboration with different countries to work on it. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Long. Well, he mentioned something very important towards the end, especially concerning the second session and the third session. We talked about the importance of arts education as a tool. And so because of arts education as a tool, we believe that sometimes we do not realize the important socioeconomic impact of arts education. And that actually leads to the marginalization of arts education in various communities. In order to overcome this challenge, we need to collaborate on a global level, especially through UNITWIN, which brings together scholars, practitioners, and researchers. So that will lead to advocacy of art and arts education. Thank you very much.
So now let's go on to the last session of yesterday. And this is something that comes up every time. This topic was about Seoul Agenda, and Professor In-Seol Kim of Catholic University will summarize. Yes, thank you. Yesterday, I was actually here, and once again, I am here greeting you on stage. In 2019, I was able to meet some people, and although it's via a monitor, it's a pleasure to meet you and see your faces again. Now, yesterday, I served as a moderator for session 4 on the topic of the Seoul Agenda. And so, because I served as a moderator, I kept on thinking about time management. I know that there are quite a number of people who have to review the different sessions. And I will try to make my review of session 4 as short as possible. Now, the Seoul agenda was the topic of the session, but actually we didn't talk about the Seoul agenda itself. I'm sure that there were some of you who have already heard the presentations or looked through the presentation, but we looked at the fundamental goal that arts education pursues. And Seoul agenda, I think that there are many people in Korea who do not know what the Seoul agenda is actually about. Professor Chang mentioned this, but in May of 2010, the International Arts Education Week took place and the Seoul agenda was declared. And then in 2011, the UNESCO member states unanimously adopted this as a global declaration for arts education. So if you are interested in arts education, I'm sure you remember this as a historic moment for arts education. And so this year, once again, we are celebrating the International Arts Education Week. And Seoul Agenda is actually part of the heritage of this International Arts Education Week. Now, yesterday, we had to change the order of presentation. And so the first presenter was actually Catherine Coleman and Mark Selkirk and Abby. But let me just speak about Professor Benjamin Bolden and Professor Neryl's presentation first. So the important research networks, some of them were created after the Seoul Declaration, and one of them would be UNITWIN. And every year, a yearbook is issued, and they work on this yearbook. And what they did was they introduced some of the meaningful studies that are introduced in the book. And they introduced the book to us. And Neryl and Ben, well, what they talked about was quite impressive. I will not go into the details, but if I do mention one of the commentaries that they provided, they talked about how arts education, it's taking place around the world, and there are some commonalities that we can find even though arts education is being presented in different places. And we were able to learn a lot about how we can engage in arts education and see how arts education is being carried out in the different regions and countries. Each country, of course, may have different approaches implemented, but perhaps we can look into these different approaches that have been implemented elsewhere and try to think about, can we use this? And we also have to think about the diversity or diversifying the approaches and the discourse, for example. So I think that we were able to think about those during that, while listening to that presentation. The second presentation was given by Professor Chi-Hu Lam and also Gente, environmental artist and educator. They provided us with a wonderful video for their presentation. It was, I think, a very unique presentation. Rather than showing slides or a presentation deck, we actually were able to see Zen talk in a gallery where she had worked in. And she talked about how artworks can be used as a means of an artistic education approach. So it was, I think, very new and it was impressive. And also we were able to look and hear from Zen in a very unique venue, usually that we don't see at symposiums and a gallery. And I am willing to actually look at that, watch that video again. If you have not seen it yet, you can go into our website and you can actually see the video. When we think about the Seoul agenda, you can say that Seoul Agenda is like a detailed action plan for further advancing arts education. So I think that more detailed objectives and goals are contained in the Seoul Agenda. And first, it talks about the approach of arts education and also the accessibility of arts education. For example, no one should be excluded, and we should be able to present arts education to more people and have arts education really influence their daily lives. And number two is about the quality of arts education. And number three is about what we can accomplish through arts education. For example, there can be many different social and cultural impacts of arts education. And I think that the work by Zen, for example, and also the dialogue between Professor Chi-Hu Lam and Zen, I think, is related to the third goal of the Seoul Agenda. The last presentation, according to our program, was a presentation by Catherine and Mark and Abby. And I think that this presentation was about number one and number two goals of Seoul Agenda, especially thinking about the current pandemic situation. They talked about how the lockdown took place in Australia for over 200 days. And they talked about how efforts were made to really, despite the situation, the lockdown, many efforts were made by arts educators within Australia. And they talked about the macro, meso, and micro level of the endeavors. And while I was listening to the presentation, I thought, we're talking about arts education. We are from different countries. We have different cultural backgrounds. But nevertheless, we have shared a common experience during this time of a pandemic. And Abby, in the later part of the presentation, she mentioned that we have met unexpected challenges, that these challenges were unexpected, unpredictable. Actually, she was given the question about some of the unexpected challenges. And she talked about one of the things that she talked about was concerns about funding, for example. And she talked about some of the points that made me realize that although we're from different backgrounds, we really have similar concerns. And we should actually try to tackle these common concerns through our studies and research. So I think that going forward, as it was mentioned by Boa, arts education, well, the essence of arts education and the mechanism of arts education should be looked into more and identified, and that's something that we should work together on. And also we have to think about the roles and responsibilities as researchers of arts education. I'm sorry, I apologize. I said that I would make this very short, but it was longer than anyone else. Yes, actually, I expected that, so that's not a surprise. Anyhow, yes, we're being delayed, and I always tell moderators to do good time management, but as a moderator, I'm not doing that much of a good time. But nevertheless, because this is the last session, as a moderator, I think that I am given the privilege to kind of extend the time for the session a little bit. So I would like to ask the participants of the session, if you have anything to say, you can raise your hand. For example, Professor Akuno or Professor Bach or Professor Lung, for example, or Professor Shonmin. If you have anything to say, then please raise your hand. But I would like to add on something. Now, yesterday, there was a session about the Seoul agenda, as it was mentioned. And today, well, the first presentation of today was actually the second keynote for the UNITWIN symposium, and it was given by Dr. Benjamin Werison.
Well, the second plenary session talked about responsibility, and he talked about aesthetic resilience and cultural resilience. So we found the meaning of sustainability in art identity. Diaspora would be included in this topic. We also talked about the contact between humans and nature to find the potential for sustainability of art and arts education. For example, the potential to maintain a good life. Many of the discussions concerning these topics would be included under this topic. And in line with this sustainability, he talks about resilience, especially Katharina Brown's resilience has been named. And it talks about how we can utilize the available resources to induce changes in various social groups. Sustainability and resilience will surely have to go through administrative and political processes. And so we need to set a goal in order to have international cooperation. And Werison talks about how transformative learning is the framework that we should be using in actively utilizing the resources of art and arts education so that we could have a new balance of the identity and sustainability. Professor Werison, using Dr. Brown's research, talked about the various pillars, and one of them is rootedness and resourcefulness. Well, I believe that resourcefulness is the ability to use resource, and then we have resistance. Professor Werison talked about these three pillars and then connecting them to three chains and organically connecting them together in order to take a look at the various values of arts education. And so along that line, identity is not something that is static, but it is open to change. And based on these three elements, we can respond preemptively to the world through arts education. Well, it gave me a lot of food for thought, and especially arts and entrepreneurship is the topic of my research, and so it gave us great ideas. Especially for collectivism and activism, we can strengthen resilience, and I believe that that is linked to solidarity that emphasizes the field. There are so many things I want to mention about solidarity, but we are pressed for time. But if we go into the classrooms, that is where solidarity happens. And so let's go to the fifth session titled Arts in the Classroom. Let's go to Professor Shaman.
Thank you. Just to say at the beginning that even though we are looking on each other through these little small windows for 3 days, we can be inspired and share our knowledge, and it's really intriguing. And I would like to thank very much to the organizer of doing such a wonderful work that enabled this effort. I was happy to review this session, Arts in the Classrooms. We all know that school arts are a hybrid genre, but I want to stress that it's hybrid genre in the sense that they exist between educational and artistic institutions. And if they can merge, thus they have a unique power to influence. If I follow Gilles Deleuze, the French philosopher, who said, we die a little every day without the arts. We die a little every day without the arts. We can be sure that teachers in classrooms are privileged to explore arts every day and thus to be fully alive and enthusiastic, as we could see the 5 presenters in this session. I value the session subject because I believe that profound and prolonged work in classrooms is the ultimate way to achieve the goals that he put in front of us. Now, I would like to go and identify 4 significant tendencies that I saw in this session. First and foremost is that arts education has defined its identity in this session by empathy and care. Empathy and care through different ways of learning. For Mary Claire, I took only one small idea from each of the presentations because each presentation was very rich and full and it can't be covered in the amount of time that we have. So I just picked one idea that make reason to me when I was listening. So for Mary Claire, I took the idea that celebrating the small wins can promote a positive mental attitude. I love it. I love the spotlight that small wins can cultivate a bigger ones. And she gave it on the background of aesthetic theoretical convincing framework. And I like the challenges and the hope that she posed to us. From Emily, I take the workshop design, also in virtual platform, and to reveal how puppetry can offer a sense of inclusivity, joy, and uniqueness, which is the stress of all students, for all of one. From G.Hay, I take the idea of responsibility to reflect the times we live in through our artistry. She brings the notion of diversity and cultural representations into the classrooms, and she is sharing musical education experience, her musical experience, which is very rich, deep, and with great care. From Emily and Neville, I take the level of enthusiasm and sheer joy from the students in addition to the learning outcomes. I love the spotlight on the stories, but on the joy and the happiness and the enthusiasm that they sought out from listening and giving the students voices and chances. I believe that this is one of the essential elements in arts in school. The second tendency is the applied arts, or let's say the instrumental arts that matter. All presenters believe in the personal, social, emotional effect that arts must have. The third tendency is, I like it best, moving from idea to implementation when fostering creativity and critical thinking. I found this direction inspiring, looking at how different teachers and artists have made this move. And the last one here is what I miss. Maybe I couldn't hear it, maybe it wasn't the presentation themselves, but I missed a smell, I say, of taking risk on any level. A smell of fighting with dangers, because there are so many dangers outside. I found all the presentation, even in the whole symposium, very smooth. We are doing this and this and this, and we have success. Less speaking of what are the real danger via the arts themselves that we are dealing with. Or maybe I'm wrong, I'm not sure. Finally, I would like to make few remarks for our future work and say this. We also heard in this session and others that arts are good for me, for you, for society, for. Arts are tool to healing, to. However, let's not forget that the arts are important in their own right for education. They don't need to be, from my perspective, they don't need to be justified as tool for. Art recreates the human order and insists on a human response. And this is also exactly the essence of education. Thus, we need to continue deepening our understanding of how the arts are a place to personal meaning from which tentative use of the word can be alerted, rejected, or made more secure, as Elliot Eisner once learned us. Furthermore, and this is the last note, we still need to better understand the so-called transformative power of the arts, to go deeply into the idea of the transformative and how it works. I suggest to go on by learning the historical critical approach and by following giants from all cultures as a source of ethical vision and human values. Thank you.
감사합니다. 슈프라 교수님. 저는 사실
Yes, thank you very much. Now, listening to the review by the professor, actually, I had so much to say, so much to respond to, but because of the time limit, I cannot do so, unfortunately. So I have so much to talk about session 5, but unfortunately, there's a time constraint. So if you're interested in what you've just heard, as you know, you can go to the UNITWIN website, and the videos will remain there until May 30th. So please gain access to the website and watch the videos. They're open until May 30th. So please check out the videos, check out the presentations. Because of the time constraint, we have to go on to the next review.
Session 6 will be reviewed by Director Shin-Sun. She moderated the session as well. So, Director Shin, you moderated the session titled Arts Engagement. Could you review the session for us, please? Well, about 2 hours ago, or 2 to 3 hours ago, we had session 6 under the title of Arts Engagement. Well, I listened to the presentations and I could talk about what I reflected based on the presentations. Professor Sheffron talked about the transformative power of arts. That really can be obtained through arts engagement. I think that is the crucial element that we can obtain through arts engagement. The topic of arts engagement is vital, especially in the pandemic era, because we are asking so many questions about methodology and format. Concerning the presentations in session 6, we need to think about the post-pandemic era. Coupled with the fourth industrial revolution, inevitably, we will go through online learning or blended learning, and it will inevitably be a part of arts education. So, for diversification, what are the concerns that arts educators should have? And I believe that discussions related to this were conducted during session 6, and I do believe that continuous dialogue will be necessary for this topic. The first and second presentation talked about the practice of arts education during the pandemic, and Professor Che talked about the role of arts educators as well as the practical issues such as the tools which are connected to copyrights. In the modern world, many of the borders are being faded, and that's something that we are experiencing. And so, given this environment, the identity of arts educators is being shaken, and this is actually in line with the fading borders. And so, should arts educators take on all of this burden? I don't believe so. Because if the borders are being faded, then that type of confusion and challenge is being faced by both sides of the border. And so, in the end, we need to solve this issue through cooperation, coexistence, and collaboration. And so, the second presentation by Professor Hong Hae-yeon and Sung Hye-jin talked about how the limited participation of the students in an online environment could be used for arts education. And they mentioned how we need to focus on bilateral conversation. So we can use an artwork to create narratives and share interpretations of the artwork and create social capital through the sharing of everyone's interpretations. Social distancing is continuing and direct exchanges are difficult, and that actually leads to bipolarization of society and various forms of hate crime. And so concerning this, arts education and arts engagement can act in a positive way to bring the society back together. And so I believe that it was a very timely presentation. The first presentation was by Professor Rebecca Khan from Danyang University, along with Fu Se-ming and Tan Se-xuan, and they talked about service learning. They talked about arts education and social participation, as well as facilitating exchanges between different classes. El Sistema is well known even in Korea, and they have contributed to expanding arts education. The service learning that was presented in this presentation is understood to be an approach from the perspective of arts educators. Arts educators would understand the community, plan for arts activities, and execute them. And this actually is based on Dewey's theory of learning by doing. And in this presentation, what was also interesting was that not only were we talking about social activities, but there was also international collaboration. This is different from ODA. It actually deals with various vulnerable groups around the world, and that was very impressive. Arts education goes beyond my community, and it expands collaboration, and it actually showed the potential of applying to social changes. And arts education became very innovative amidst the crisis. We had Director Jeff Pollin present from Creative Generation. So Creative Generation actually works with researchers so that arts education can go beyond art. By participating in art, we can develop literacy, especially cultural literacy, and that could also lead to the respect of other cultures. That could translate into respect for others as well as social cohesion. Currently, there are hate crimes against certain races, and this actually becomes a very big issue, especially in the U.S. Of course, this is not only an issue unique to the U.S., but arts education can be used as a tool to facilitate changes for society. And through the presentations of session 6, we were able to see that arts engagement enables us to not only participate in art, but we are able to provide a platform for dialogue using art as a tool. How horizontal and inclusive this dialogue becomes will be very important for arts educators. Thank you very much.
지금 신혜선
Well,
대표님의
we have heard from Director Shin. I have so much that I would like to add, but we are past our schedule, so we need to go to session 7.
And the theme of session 7 actually shows how much diverse topics we have to talk about. Session 7 was about diversity and cultural representation, and this will be reviewed by Chairperson Shin Park of cases. Yes, we are behind schedule, so let me make this very brief. Now, in session 7, which was about diversity and cultural representation, we were able to look into arts education's overall goal, and also, in some sense, the goal and objective of UNITWIN, because I do believe it's about cultural diversity. And also, UNITWIN's topic is in line with this as well. When we deal with the topic of climate crisis, I think that we also have to think about diversity. So, another point, a unique point about the session is that there were 4 different topics dealt with, and we could actually compare the situations with the Korean situation. So in Korea, when we think about diversity, well, there are certain issues that are raised, but we were able to listen to the presentations and think about the diversity issues that were raised in the presentations and compare them with the Korean situation. And so first, Professor Ruth, she talks about arts in times of crisis, the case of inequality. She introduced how artists and also indigenous people and the disabled, the challenges that they are faced with in Australia. And she talked about the role of art in this situation, how art can help overcome the challenges. She gave a number of examples, and also in relation to the disabled, she mentioned a certain project and she introduced her views about the related program. The second presentation was provided by Professor Shim of Hongik University, and the topic for this presentation was LGBTQ. In the US, 2 museums. One is the National Portrait Museum, and another is a private Brooklyn museum, and the 2 museums were compared together. Now, the artwork relating the LGBTQ issue was dealt with through an exhibition in each of the art museums, while in the National Portrait Gallery, actually, there were some limitations. For example, there was a video work which involved the image of Jesus, but this led to backlash by the Catholics, and this led to a shutdown of the exhibition, whereas at the Brooklyn Museum, we could see that the exhibition that took place there led to a discourse about LGBTQ and also generated into many different sideline events dealing with the topic of LGBTQ, and this resulted in more widespread dialogue about the topic. So we could see that around the world, the issue of LGBTQ sometimes leads to controversy, but what Professor Shim was emphasizing was, and this was explained while answering a question about the Korean situation, is that in Korea there are still a lot of challenges that we have to overcome. And then from Ewha Women's University, Professor Kim and Park gave a presentation on a unique Korean situation. The Korean peninsula is divided, and because we have been separated into north and south for such a long time, we have to acknowledge that there are cultural differences, and we have to acknowledge cultural diversity even on the Korean peninsula. And this has become a topic for discourse. So having said that, the young North Korean defectors and South Korean youth, they participated in a village making project. And so there was a phenomenological study of this community-based art project. And we could see that the young North Korean defectors actually were willing to engage in dialogue. There was a lot of analysis that took place and introduced in this presentation, which showed the reality of North and South Korea. Now, I think that around the globe, we can see many different types of diversity in ethnicity, in religion, in gender, identities, in occupations. But I think that there is a unique diversity that exists on the Korean Peninsula because we are the last divided country in the world, a sad but existing reality. And last but not least, from the Queen's University of Canada, PhD candidate Sean Corcoran and also Professor Benjamin Bolden jointly gave a presentation about how Canada's El Sistema program responded to the COVID-19 pandemic. This was a very interesting case study that was presented, and what was most impressive was that the El Sistema program had to change fundamentally under this pandemic situation. The pedagogy had to change, and also the musical selections had to change. Under this very challenging times, why do we have to continue with this music program was explained. In the U.S., ethnical issues still remain, and so how these issues are dealt with through arts education was also introduced, and they mentioned that they wanted to compare the El Sistema program with similar programs in other countries. In Korea, we also have a similar program led by CASES, and this Dream Orchestra, that's the title of the orchestra here in Korea. In the case of Korea, because there is so much stress over academic performance, there's a very unique environment that the students are placed in. And so this presentation actually led me to think about the educational environment here in Korea. Once again, we thought about diversity in this session, and even in this pandemic situation, I think that we are swept with many different diversity-related challenges. Diversity has been hard hit. For example, there is hate crimes against Asians. So I think that there was a step backwards when it comes to diversity. So we have to think about how we will be overcoming this challenge. And as it was noted by Professor Benjamin in the keynote address, we have to actually build resilience in a new way so that we can really foster cultural diversity. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much, Chairperson Park. I know that she wanted to say so much more because there was a lot of discussion that went on right before the session, but because of time constraint, unfortunately, we cannot discuss all of the various issues that came up.
Let us go to the last session. This was moderated by Professor Hong Yoo-jin, and she will summarize the session. We ended just a little while ago, and I will be summarizing that session for you. Many of the sessions dealt with the pandemic, but in the last session, which I moderated, we had a lot of topics related to the pandemic. The 8th session was titled Arts and Education in Field 2. I think a subtitle for this could have been Arts Education Faced with the Pandemic, What Shall We Do? And How We Overcame the Challenge. I think that's the subtitle that we could have for this session because many of the presentations talked about detailed case studies of how they overcame the pandemic situation. COVID-19 actually limited arts education that focused on using our 5 senses in a space that we gather in. But arts education was challenged because we could not meet face-to-face nor use all of our senses. So arts education was challenged by social distancing and also quarantines. So everyone was marginalized from arts education, and we took a look at various case studies in this situation. Pandemic asked arts education to make new attempts, and all 5 of the presenters talked about how they struggled to overcome the challenges, and they shared their very well-planned experiences. Well, Chang Soo-hye of Czech 문화 Project talked about how she had worked with various schools and community centers to conduct arts education, and the presentation was about how all of that was switched to the online platform and how she had to have opportunities to study for this new situation to bring together online and offline platforms for her arts classes. She had a very specific target for her education, and so she had inevitably applied various methodologies. And so she was able to utilize various activities to apply for her specific target. The second presenter was freelance teaching artist Bong Yoon-ji, and she actually worked with teenagers, and she was faced with an online situation which is mainly based on screen, and so the senses that you could use were only hearing and seeing. And so that is why she chose to use picture books. Picture books could be seen and it could be read aloud. And so that is why picture books were a very effective mechanism. And she also worked with various concepts such as the growth of the youth and asking each other's regards during the pandemic situation. And she also utilized the situation very strategically. So she used picture books to compensate for the 3 senses that could not be used in an online situation. And she looked at new ways to overcome the online learning situation. The third presentation was by Director Lee Yeon-jung of GA Garden, and she approached this from the context point of view. If we take a look at the history of humankind, there's always been diseases that impacted relationships, and we can see that interpersonal relations were severed because of different diseases, and there were even cases where hate was placed on specific groups of people. So she talked about the negative impact of relationships, and that was dealt with as a topic for visual art activities. So the emotional changes that we would go through when we are infected, and she also shared images and poetry to express the changes in our emotions, and also to take a look at a new perspective of relationships. That is what she did through arts education. The fourth presentation was by teaching artist Bae Sung-jong. He worked with students in an online and offline platform. So he had limited number of in-person gatherings that he could have with his students. And so in a limited amount of time, the students actually needed to come up with a performance at the end of the semester. And so what he did was he found ways to further communicate with his students to come up with a performance at the end. He started out in trying to focus on theater, but the new creation that they had at the end of the semester was what they called an audio webtoon. The fifth presentation was by Chae Young-hee of Korea Arts and Culture Education Service, and they actually had a project that targeted a specific group, seniors in high school. They had finished their Korean SATs and they were waiting to go to college. And so a very specific group of people in transition. So they wanted to focus on how to bridge that transition through arts education. Not only are they going through the pandemic, but they actually have the memory of various crises that Korea went through. And so her project was focused on enabling them to reflect upon the crisis that they had experienced in the past. She used kits so that the students could proactively participate in the program, and they were also able to share their results. So we have heard 5 presentations for session 8, and through their presentations, we could see that the pandemic situation is giving new challenges and also potential for arts education in terms of methodology and contents. Well, last year when COVID-19 broke out, we were struggling to overcome the situation, but a full year has passed by. But now, not only do we see limitations, but now we can talk about potentials as well. Pandemic and the arts education is related to goal 3 of the Seoul Agenda, but the impact of the pandemic is quite immense. So not only is it connected to goal 3, but we need to take a look at how arts education should approach these challenges and limitations, and it actually gives us a lot of food for thought for our future. And so I believe that it is very closely linked with goals 1, 2, 3 of the Seoul Agenda. So we are at a point in time where we are opening the new doors to arts education. Given the pandemic situation, we need to think about how we're going to respond to these challenges through arts education. And in the end, these situations not only remind us once again of the importance of arts education, but it also shows that the imagination that has been accumulated through arts education now needs to show how powerful it is by contributing to society. Thank you very much.
Yes. Well, around the world, many people are joining us for this symposium, and I have never seen a closing ceremony that has been so carefully prepared for. For the past 3 days, all of the presentations and the papers were reviewed for the session. I would like to thank everyone for participating in this review session. For example, Professor Bakakuno, Leung, Seanman, Shin, Kim, Hong, Park, all the professors, thank you very much, and Chairperson Park, thank you very much. So we have hosted the 4th UNITWIN Symposium. This is all that we have prepared. If time allows, it would have been great if we were able to engage in more dialogue, but as always, we were given a set period of time, so it is now time to say goodbye. There was topics that we had agreed upon, and I do believe that what we discuss can be reflected in the field, and for that we need your help and support. So with this, I would like to conclude the 4th UNITWIN Symposium 2021. Thank you very much, everyone around the world, for joining us for the past 3 days, the practitioners, the academics, everyone involved, and also the organizers' cases. Thank you very much. Members of UNITWIN, thank you. We will meet you next year at the UNITWIN Symposium. Thank you very much.